Across the street, lace curtains twitched as curious eyes peered through them. Mrs. Thompson, a woman in her mid-50s who'd appointed herself as the unofficial guardian of Oak Ridge Avenue, gripped her morning coffee mug tightly. She'd lived in the neighborhood for over 15 years and prided herself on knowing every coming and going on the street. Today was different. Through her window, she watched the scene unfolding at number 427 with growing unease. The moving truck wasn't what bothered her. She'd known the house had been sold. What caught her attention was the man directing the movers. She grabbed her phone, fingers flying across the screen as she fired off messages to her neighborhood watch group chat. "Unknown man at the Miller's old house," she typed. "Expensive-looking SUV, but something feels off." Her thumbs hovered over the phone for a moment before adding, "Keep your doors locked, everyone." As she continued her surveillance, more messages flooded the group chat. "Maybe it's the new owner," someone suggested. Mrs. Thompson scoffed, nearly spilling her coffee. In her mind, this man didn't fit her image of who belonged in their upscale community. She'd heard rumors about a new homeowner, but surely the real estate agent would have mentioned, well, certain details. The morning sun climbed higher as she watched the man efficiently organizing boxes and furniture. Despite his clearly professional attire and methodical approach, something stirred in her that she didn't want to acknowledge. Her own prejudices, wrapped in the thin disguise of neighborhood security concerns. She picked up her phone again, this time opening her neighborhood watch app. The man was now unpacking his SUV, carefully carrying what looked like framed photographs into the house. "Suspicious activity continues," she logged into the app. "Subject appears to be moving items into the house. Very unusual for a break-in, don't you think?" She added a laughing emoji, trying to mask her obvious implications with humor. A few neighbors walked their dogs past the house, some stopping to chat with the new arrival. Mrs. Thompson felt her face flush with irritation as she watched them exchange friendly greetings. "They're being too trusting," she muttered to herself, conveniently forgetting how she'd never once questioned any other new arrivals to the neighborhood. Her phone buzzed with responses from the group chat. Most ignored her warnings, instead sharing excitement about a new neighbor. One message caught her eye. "I heard the house sold to someone important in law enforcement." Mrs. Thompson dismissed this immediately. After all, she would have heard about that at last week's town hall meeting, the one she'd skipped to attend her weekly bridge game. As the morning wore on, Mrs. Thompson's anxiety grew. The man moved with such confidence as if he belonged there. He even waved to passing cars and greeted other neighbors with a warm smile. It bothered her that no one else seemed concerned. Where was their sense of vigilance? Their commitment to neighborhood safety? She watched as he carried a large box marked OFFICE into the house. Through her binoculars, kept handy for bird watching, she could see him carefully unpacking what appeared to be professional certificates and plaques. Still, she convinced herself something wasn't right. In her mind, she was protecting her community, refusing to acknowledge that her concerns stemmed from something far more problematic than neighborhood safety. The scene continued to unfold before her, every normal action somehow transformed by her biased lens into something suspicious. She didn't realize that her next actions would not only embarrass her deeply, but would also force her to confront the uncomfortable truth about her own prejudices. As she reached for her phone once again, she had no idea she was about to become the subject of a story that would ripple through their community for months to come. The peaceful morning air was suddenly broken by the click-clack of determined footsteps. The new homeowner looked up from the box he was carrying to see a woman marching down her driveway from across the street. Her face was set with a look of stern determination, phone clutched tightly in her hand like a weapon. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced politeness that suggested anything but. "What exactly do you think you're doing here?" She stopped at the edge of the driveway, maintaining what she considered a safe distance while positioning herself to block the path to the front door. The new police chief set down his box carefully, straightened up, and offered a friendly smile. "Good morning," he said warmly. "I'm just moving in today. It's nice to meet you." He took a step forward, extending his hand in greeting, but she took a quick step backward. "Moving in?" she questioned, her eyebrows rising. "I wasn't informed about any new neighbors. I'm the head of the neighborhood watch, you see, and we keep very careful track of who comes and goes around here." She gestured vaguely at the moving truck. "This all seems very sudden." The chief maintained his composure, years of dealing with tense situations evident in his calm demeanor. "Not sudden at all, actually. The sale closed last month. I'm sure it was announced at the town hall meeting last week." He paused, then added with a knowing look, "Though I understand not everyone could attend." This seemed to fluster her momentarily, but she quickly regained her stance. "Well, I find it hard to believe the real estate agent would have sold without consulting the neighborhood committee. This is a very exclusive community, you understand. We have standards to maintain." A mover appeared with another box, and the chief politely excused himself to direct where it should go. This seemed to agitate the woman further. "I'm not finished," she said sharply. "I'll need to see some proof that you actually belong here." The chief turned back to her, his expression now more measured. "Ma'am, I've shown the movers my ID. I have all my paperwork inside. And frankly, I'm quite busy with moving in right now. Perhaps we could continue this welcome later." "Welcome?" she scoffed. "This isn't a welcome. This is a security check. If you can't prove right now that you own this house, I'll have no choice but to call the authorities." She raised her phone meaningfully, finger hovering over the keypad. The chief looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head slightly. "You know what? Go ahead. Call them. I think that might actually clear things up quite nicely." There was something in his tone, a hint of irony, perhaps, that she completely missed. "Fine, I will," she declared, already dialing. She turned slightly away, speaking in what she clearly thought was a hushed voice, but was actually quite audible. "Yes, hello. I need to report a suspicious person at 427 Oak Ridge Drive. He's claiming to be moving in, but I know for a fact." The chief went back to unloading boxes, occasionally glancing at his watch. He'd hoped to avoid this kind of confrontation on his first day in the neighborhood, but somehow he'd known it was coming. As he carried another box inside, he could hear her describing him in detail to the dispatcher, her voice getting increasingly agitated when they didn't seem to share her sense of urgency. What she didn't realize was that her call had just set in motion a series of events that would leave her wishing she'd never appointed herself as the neighborhood's gatekeeper. In just a few minutes, her world was about to be turned upside down in the most unexpected way possible. Standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, the woman clutched her phone tightly as she spoke to the 911 dispatcher. "Yes, I'm telling you. He just showed up with a moving truck. No, I don't care what papers he claims to have. Something isn't right here, and I need officers to come check it out immediately." The dispatcher's voice remained professionally calm, though there was an odd note in it that the woman couldn't quite place. "Ma'am, could you describe the person again?" the dispatcher asked, their tone suggesting they were trying very hard not to smile. "He's wearing a blue button-down shirt and khakis," she reported, watching as the new homeowner continued calmly directing the movers. "He's got this expensive-looking SUV, but that doesn't mean anything. Anyone can rent a nice car these days." Her voice rose with frustration as she added, "And he's acting like he owns the place." The dispatcher paused for a moment before responding. "Ma'am, we'll send officers right away." There was another pause. "Though I should mention," but the woman had already hung up, satisfied that action would finally be taken. Across the street, the new police chief was carefully unpacking a box of family photos in his living room when he heard the familiar sound of police sirens in the distance. He glanced at his watch and shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The movers looked up nervously, but he reassured them with a wave. Don't worry, folks. Keep working. This'll all be sorted out in a minute. The woman stood straighter as two police cruisers pulled up to the house, their lights flashing. She watched with satisfaction as two officers stepped out, adjusting their uniforms. Her satisfaction, however, was about to take a dramatic turn. The officers approached the house, and the woman hurried over to meet them. Thank goodness you're here. He's right over there. She stopped mid-sentence, confusion washing over her face as both officers suddenly snapped to attention. Good morning, Chief. They called out in perfect unison as the new homeowner stepped onto his front porch. Their backs were straight, their faces showing nothing but respect and recognition. The woman's mouth dropped open. She blinked several times as if trying to clear her vision. Chief? She squeaked out. Officers, the man replied warmly, walking down his front steps. I see you got our neighbor's call. Thank you for responding so quickly. He turned to the woman, whose face had gone from red to white in record time. I suppose I should properly introduce myself now. I'm the new chief of police. I would have mentioned it earlier, but you seemed more interested in calling my officers than having a conversation. The younger officer tried desperately to hide a grin as his partner radioed back to dispatch. Situation at Oak Ridge Drive resolved. False alarm. It's just the chief moving into his new house. The dispatcher's response crackled over the radio, 10-4. We kind of figured that's what was happening. The woman stood frozen, her phone now hanging limply at her side. Around them, several neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the police lights. They gathered on their lawns, some whispering, others not bothering to hide their amusement at the unfolding scene. I didn't, the woman stammered, her face now flushing deep red. Nobody told me. Actually, one of the officers chimed in helpfully. It was announced at last week's town hall meeting. There was quite a celebration. The chief's appointment is historic for our department. The woman's embarrassment was complete. She stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, as the realization of what she'd done, and what it revealed about her, sank in. But this moment of humiliation was about to become more than just an uncomfortable encounter. It would mark the beginning of a significant change in their community, though none of them knew it yet. The morning sun now hung high in the sky, casting short shadows on the gathering crowd of neighbors who'd come out to witness the scene. The two police officers stood at ease, occasionally exchanging knowing glances as their new chief handled the situation with remarkable grace. Would you like to help us with a box or two? The chief asked the officers with a warm smile. I've got some office equipment that could use a careful hand. The officers eagerly moved to assist, their boots crunching on the gravel driveway as they headed toward the moving truck. The woman who'd made the call remained rooted to her spot, her face a canvas of competing emotions. Embarrassment, confusion, and the slow dawning of realization about her own actions. Nearby neighbors had begun to whisper among themselves. That's the new police chief she called the cops on. One neighbor explained to another who'd just walked up. You know, the one they introduced at the town hall meeting last week. Made the front page of the local paper and everything. The chief turned back to the still stunned woman. You know, I was planning to host a neighborhood coffee, meet, and greet next weekend anyway. Why don't you come? We can start fresh. His voice carried no hint of anger or resentment, just genuine openness. One of the officers emerged from the house, carefully carrying a framed certificate. Chief, where would you like your commendation for community service displayed? He asked loudly enough for everyone to hear. The other officer followed, holding a prestigious law enforcement leadership award. The growing crowd of neighbors began to approach, some carrying welcome baskets they'd hurriedly put together. An elderly gentleman stepped forward, extending his hand to the chief. I was at the town hall meeting, he said proudly. Your speech about community policing was inspiring. We're lucky to have you here. More neighbors joined in, forming an impromptu welcome line. "I brought some homemade cookies," called out a woman in a floral dress. "They're getting cold." Another neighbor appeared with a pitcher of fresh lemonade and stack of paper cups. The woman who'd made the call watched as her neighbors, the very people she claimed to protect, warmly embraced their new community member. The same man she just reported as suspicious was now the center of an impromptu welcome party, chatting easily with everyone, remembering names, and asking thoughtful questions about the neighborhood. The officers, still helping with the move, shared stories about their first impressions of their new chief. "You should have seen him at training last week," one officer told the gathered neighbors. "Already knows everyone's names, their families, their goals. Never seen anything like it." Through it all, the chief maintained his composure, greeting each neighbor with genuine interest and warmth. He'd dealt with prejudice before, but he believed in turning these moments into opportunities for growth rather than division. A young couple who lived next door brought over their kids, who immediately became fascinated by the police officers' badges. The chief knelt down to their level, pulled out 2 junior police badges from his pocket. He always kept a few handy, and pinned them on the delighted children. The woman who'd made the call began to back away slowly, hoping to retreat to her house unnoticed. But before she could leave, she heard the chief's voice. "Don't forget, coffee next weekend." Sometimes, the best connections come from awkward beginnings. As the morning's tension dissolved into an unexpected block party, it became clear that this wasn't just about a new neighbor moving in. It was about a community facing its prejudices head-on and finding a path towards something better. The chief's patient handling of the situation had turned what could have been a divisive moment into an opportunity for connection. Little did anyone know that this morning's events would spark a transformation in their community, beginning with one humble neighborhood watch coordinator who had a lot of thinking to do. Word spread through Oak Ridge Avenue like wildfire. By early afternoon, the story of the morning's events had reached every corner of the neighborhood. Parents chatted about it at the bus stop, joggers paused their runs to discuss it, and phones buzzed with messages sharing different versions of what had happened. "Did you hear?" one neighbor asked another over their shared fence. "The lady from the neighborhood watch called the police on our new police chief." The story got more interesting with each retelling, though the core truth remained the same. Someone's prejudice had been exposed in the most embarrassing way possible. Back at her house, the woman who'd made the call sat in her darkened living room, blinds drawn, replaying the morning's events in her mind. Her phone kept lighting up with messages from the neighborhood group chat, but she couldn't bring herself to read them. The same group chat where, just hours ago, she'd been warning everyone about a suspicious person. Her husband arrived home early after hearing what happened. "You did what?" he exclaimed, dropping his briefcase by the door. "I told you to come to the town hall meeting last week." They introduced him to everyone. There was cake and everything. Meanwhile, at the chief's house, the moving truck had finally pulled away. The impromptu welcome party had dispersed, leaving behind plates of cookies, welcome cards, and casserole dishes. The 2 officers who'd responded to the call were among the last to leave, having helped arrange the chief's home office. "Thank you both," the chief said, walking them to their patrol car. "And remember, this morning stays between us. No teasing at the station." The officers nodded, though they couldn't quite hide their smiles. It would take superhuman restraint not to share such a perfect story of irony. As afternoon turned to evening, more neighbors stopped by. An older couple brought dinner. You can't cook on moving day. The local kid's soccer coach dropped off a team jersey. "We'd love to have you at our games, Chief." Each visitor tried to subtly apologize for the morning's incident without directly mentioning it. The chief accepted each gesture with grace, turning every conversation toward the future rather than dwelling on the past. He shared his vision for community policing, his open-door policy, and his hope to bridge the gap between law enforcement and residents. Many left feeling inspired, already planning ways to get involved. Across the street, the woman finally gathered the courage to look at her phone. Instead of the angry messages she expected, she found something worse: silence. She'd been removed from the neighborhood watch group chat. Her self-appointed position as community guardian had crumbled in the space of a morning. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Oak Ridge Avenue, a young girl rode past the chief's house on her bicycle. She rang her bell and waved cheerfully, not seeing anything unusual about her new neighbor. The chief waved back, smiling at the simple gesture of acceptance. The day's events had revealed an uncomfortable truth about lingering prejudices in even the most progressive neighborhoods. But they'd also shown how quickly things could change when confronted with reality. The woman who'd made the call didn't know it yet, but her mistake would eventually lead to something positive, though that part of the story was still to come. Standing on his new front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, the chief reflected on the day. In his 20 years of law enforcement, he'd learned that sometimes the most powerful changes come from the most uncomfortable moments. Tomorrow would be his first official day as chief, but today had already taught the community its first lesson. Inside her house, the woman made a decision. She would attend that coffee meet and greet next weekend. It would be uncomfortable, even humiliating, but it would be a start. Sometimes, she realized, the best thing to do after a fall is to stand up and face what knocked you down. A week had passed since the moving day incident. The chief sat in his new office at the police station, reviewing the final details for tonight's community meeting. He decided to turn the uncomfortable situation into a teaching moment, sending personal invitations to every household on Oak Ridge Avenue. The conference room down the hall was already set up with chairs in a circle, not rows. This wasn't going to be a lecture. The chief believed real change happened through conversation, not confrontation. On a side table, coffee and cookies waited, making the space feel less official and more welcoming. The woman who'd made the call sat in her car in the police station parking lot, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The invitation had arrived at her door 3 days ago, hand-delivered by the chief himself. No pressure, he'd said with a gentle smile, but your voice would add something important to the conversation. She'd spent the last week barely leaving her house, embarrassed to face her neighbors. Her husband had finally convinced her to come tonight. Sometimes, he'd said, the bravest thing you can do is show up and admit you were wrong. People began arriving early. The soccer coach brought his whole team, teenagers in their bright uniforms fresh from practice. The elderly couple from down the street arrived with their grandson, a young police cadet. The local librarian came carrying books about civil rights history, offering to start a community reading group. The woman finally found the courage to walk in, keeping her eyes down. But instead of the cold shoulder she expected, several neighbors made space in their circle, offering quiet smiles of encouragement. They'd all made mistakes before. Maybe not as public, but mistakes nonetheless. The chief opened the meeting by sharing a story from his rookie days, about an older officer who'd helped him understand that changing hearts was harder than changing laws, but far more important. The room grew quiet, everyone leaning in to listen. Tonight isn't about pointing fingers, he explained, walking slowly around the circle. It's about understanding why we see what we expect to see, rather than what's actually there. He paused near the woman's chair. And it's about having the courage to admit when we're wrong, so we can do better. The conversation that followed was honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but always respectful. The soccer coach talked about teaching his players to look past differences on the field. The elderly couple shared stories of how their neighborhood had changed over 30 years. The young cadet spoke about why he wanted to become an officer. When it was her turn to speak, the woman's voice shook at first. I thought I was protecting my community, she admitted. But I never stopped to ask myself who I thought I was protecting it from, and why. The room fell silent, many nodding in understanding. The chief shared his vision for a new kind of neighborhood watch program, one based on building connections rather than suspicion, on knowing neighbors rather than watching them. Real safety, he explained, comes from community, not from fear. As the evening wound down, people lingered, forming small groups to continue the conversation. The woman found herself talking with a soccer coach about volunteering at youth games. The librarian was planning reading lists with other neighbors. Even the teenagers were engaged, asking the chief about starting a youth advisory council. The woman approached the chief as people were leaving. "I'd like to help," she said quietly, "with the new neighborhood watch program, if you'll let me." The chief smiled, noting how different she seemed from that morning a week ago. Standing in the parking lot later, watching the last cars pull away, the chief felt a sense of hope. One uncomfortable incident had sparked what could become real change in the community. Sometimes the best lessons come from the hardest moments, and sometimes the most resistant people become the strongest advocates for change once their eyes are opened. The stars were out by the time he headed home, twinkling above Oak Ridge Avenue. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight had shown that his community was ready to face them together. 3 months had passed since that eventful moving day. Oak Ridge Avenue had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The woman who once peered suspiciously through her curtains now sat on her front porch, greeting passersby with a friendly wave. On this bright Saturday morning, she was helping organize the neighborhood's first ever community safety fair. Tables lined the local park, showcasing everything from bike safety demonstrations to emergency preparedness tips. Children darted between booths, collecting junior police badges and safety whistles, their laughter filling the air. "The face painting booth needs more volunteers," she called out, checking her clipboard. She channeled her organizational skills into something positive, becoming the chief's right-hand person in community outreach. Her transformation had inspired others, showing that change was possible at any age. The chief walked through the fair, stopping to chat with everyone. He'd made good on his promise of coffee, meet, and greets, hosting them monthly in different neighbors' homes. These casual gatherings had done more to build trust than any official program ever could. At one booth, teenage volunteers demonstrated proper bike lock techniques. These were the same kids who used to get suspicious looks for hanging out in the park. Now they were safety ambassadors, wearing bright yellow vests and sharing their knowledge with younger children. "Remember when we used to call the police if we saw kids in hoodies?" One longtime resident whispered to another. "Now look at us. We know every kid by name." They watched as the chief joined the teens, adding his own tips about bike safety while the kids playfully competed to show off their lock-picking prevention knowledge. The local police officers mingled with the crowd, out of their patrol cars, and engaged in casual conversations. One officer was teaching a group of small children how to use the crosswalk safely, making it into a game that had them giggling while they learned. Near the refreshment stand, the elderly couple who'd lived in the neighborhood for decades shared stories with newer residents. "This reminds me of how things used to be," the old man said, "when everyone knew their neighbors. Only better now, more inclusive, more understanding." The woman who'd made that fateful call now stood at the welcome booth, handing out community watch guidelines she'd helped develop with the chief. The new program focused on connection rather than surveillance, replacing suspicious activity reports with neighbor assistance opportunities. "See that family there?" she said to a new volunteer, pointing to a group setting up a picnic blanket. Last week, their car wouldn't start. Instead of calling to report suspicious people around a vehicle, the new system connected them with 3 neighbors who could help jumpstart their car. The chief's vision of community policing had spread beyond Oak Ridge Avenue. Other neighborhoods were asking to implement similar programs. The local news had even done a story about their transformation, though they kept the details of that first day private. Some lessons are best learned without public shame. A group of kids ran past, wearing plastic police badges and playing a game they called Community Helpers instead of Cops and Robbers. The chief smiled, knowing that small changes like this reflected bigger shifts in how the next generation would view law enforcement and community safety. The woman checked her clipboard again, smiling at how full the volunteer sign-up sheets were. Each name represented someone choosing to be part of the solution. Even those who'd initially resisted the changes were now some of their strongest supporters. As the morning went on, more families arrived at the fair. The once quiet park buzzed with activity, conversation, and laughter. Children of different backgrounds played together while their parents chatted, sharing stories and snacks. The invisible barriers that had once divided the community were falling, one friendship at a time. Looking around at the scene, the chief felt proud. Not just of the changes he helped create, but of how the community had embraced them. Sometimes the best leadership isn't about giving orders. It's about showing people a better way forward and letting them choose to follow. 1 year had passed since that memorable moving day. The chief stood at his podium in the community center, looking out at the packed room. Today was the first anniversary of their neighborhood transformation program, and people from all over the city had come to learn about their success. The woman who'd made that life-changing phone call now sat in the front row. She'd become an unexpected champion for change, traveling to other neighborhoods to share her story. If I could overcome my prejudices, she would tell people, anyone can. Her honesty about her past mistakes had touched many hearts and opened many minds. A year ago, the chief began, his voice warm and steady. I moved into Oak Ridge Avenue with my boxes and furniture. What I didn't expect to unpack that day were this community's hidden biases. Gentle laughter rippled through the room. The story had become something of a local legend, though always told with sensitivity. The statistics displayed on the screen behind him told an impressive story. Neighborhood Watch reports of suspicious activity had dropped by 80%. Meanwhile, reports of neighbors helping neighbors had skyrocketed. Crime rates hadn't just stayed low, they'd fallen even further as the community grew stronger. But numbers don't tell the whole story, the chief continued. He pointed to a wall covered with photos. There was the first community safety fair, the Youth Advisory Council in action, neighbors helping neighbors during the big storm last winter. Each picture showed people connecting, helping, growing together. The local kids had created a presentation of their own. They played a video showing their junior community leaders program in action. Young people from different backgrounds working together on neighborhood projects. The same teenagers who once felt watched and suspicious now led volunteer initiatives. The elderly couple who'd witnessed decades of neighborhood change wiped away tears as they watched. We thought we'd seen everything, the old man whispered to his wife. But this is something special. Their grandson, now a full-fledged police officer, stood proudly in his uniform at the back of the room. The woman stood up to share her part of the story. Her hands didn't shake anymore when she spoke about that day. I thought I was protecting my community, she said, but I was actually hurting it. Real protection comes from connection, not suspicion. Real safety comes from knowing your neighbors, not fearing them. Pictures flashed across the screen. Block parties, where people who once eyed each other suspiciously now shared meals, youth sports teams that had become more inclusive, police officers playing basketball with local kids. Small moments that added up to big changes. The chief introduced their new community initiative, a mentorship program pairing experienced residents with newcomers to the neighborhood. The woman would be one of the first mentors, using her journey to help others understand the importance of looking past first impressions. Change isn't always comfortable, the chief concluded, but comfort isn't always good for us. Sometimes the most uncomfortable moments lead to the most beautiful transformations. He looked at the woman, who nodded in agreement, thinking of how far she'd come from that morning a year ago. After the presentation, people lingered to chat and share stories. Other neighborhoods wanted to know how they could create similar changes. The chief watched as his community members stepped up to share their experiences, each adding their own perspective to the larger story. The woman approached him with a smile. "Who would have thought," she said, "that my worst moment would lead to all this good?" They both looked around at the buzzing room, at people from all walks of life connecting and planning for an even better future. As the evening wound down, the chief stepped outside for a moment. The stars shone above Oak Ridge Avenue, just like they had that first night. But now the street below them was different, not just in how it looked, but in how it felt. Lights were on in houses where curtains used to be drawn. People chatted on front porches that once stood empty. Children played freely where they once felt watched. One phone call made in ignorance had sparked a transformation. One mistake had opened the door to remarkable change. And one community had shown that when people choose understanding over fear, anything is possible.